This episode is brought to you by freedadcourse.com. You are always one conversation away from changing your life, and the power of hello is something that I subscribe to every single day, and I'm always saying hello to new people everywhere I go. Increasing your opportunity, increasing your connection, and getting access to the solutions to the problems that you are facing, whether you're on active duty or just beginning your veteran transition, or you've been transitioning out for 20 years. On the other side of hello are the solutions that you're looking for. Again, head on over to freedadcourse.com. Get your 5-episode audio course to create more connection, create more friendships, and get back to living the life that you're trying to design.
Dory 1, this is Fireteam Delta. Dad's coming home.
Welcome to the Military Veteran Dad Podcast, where it is our mission to bring every dad home. I am your host, Ben Killoy. I'm a United States Marine veteran, husband, and a father. We will bring authentic conversations to inspire action in your life so we can close the gap between the dad you are today and the dad you want to be tomorrow. This is the Military Veteran Dad Podcast.
Hey guys, welcome back to Military Veteran Dad. I'm your host, Ben Killoy. This is episode 142, and this is on the other side of Thanksgiving. Hopefully, you had some great memories, whether you're away from home, whether you were connected to family, whatever it was. I hope that you were able to find some way to find joy, some way to find gratitude and thankfulness on that day where we slow down from everything right before the holidays and show gratitude for what we have in life. And if you've been listening to this podcast, I want to appreciate you. If you've been a long-time listener, whether you've just been a first-time listener or a few episodes, thank you from the bottom of my heart. These downloads continue to grow. People are out there sharing the podcast. And if that was you who shared the podcast last week, thank you for sharing that. The downloads show. If you have not shared the podcast, it is the easiest way to show gratitude towards me and help me get this podcast out to more people to help them come home as a dad. If you've gotten value from this, if you've gotten some actionable advice to apply in your life, something to change how you see the world, I appreciate if you were to share this podcast with someone that you think or know really needs to know that they're not alone as a military dad and what they're feeling. So today we have a unique episode because of where the episode came from. Andrew came into my life because I camped out in his backyard. And if there was ever a more awkward way to introduce a podcast, that is how this episode happened. Andrew is a Navy veteran who out in the middle of Kentucky has found God's earth of some amazing land. Just the sunsets and just the quietness out where this guy lives is unbelievable. I'll always remember the morning after waking up in the back of his hayfield. We were camping out there, and it was just an amazing experience. So Andrew's story is one of choosing to invite something deeper, choosing to let go of what was and fully embracing what could be. And if you've been listening to the podcast, that is something that we're often talking about, looking forward to letting go so that you can embrace what could be. As veterans, we often hold on to so many stories, so much baggage sometimes, so many different things, but it's those things that often hold us back. It's those things of what was, something we lost, no matter where that loss come from. It's that holding on to that prevents us from inviting the change that can come into our life. And that is exactly what Andrew did. He understood where he was, he understood what he needed, and he understood that he had to go to a place that maybe he'd never been to really see how life could unfold. So guys, without further ado, let's get started with this episode with Andrew Barnes, and I'll be with you on the other side for my big takeaway. Welcome to the podcast, Andrew.
Thanks. Glad to be here.
This episode got started in probably the strangest place that I have yet to start a podcast episode, and that is in the back of your farm. Myself and a good friend of mine, Dan Zahner, used HipCamp to camp at your place. And at your place, there is a mushroom farm, which we didn't really realize when we were booking it, that it was actually a farm for mushrooms. We thought it was just a place where you had mushrooms growing and that was something you could just go pick out in the wilderness. No, you actually are raising mushrooms. And it was this really interesting experience. We had a great conversation. You told us all about it. And I'm just really excited to talk to you because this is something most people don't really even get an inch, maybe even a centimeter of their world exposed to. So listening to this episode, you're going to learn a lot about mushrooms in the context of not the ones that you smoke, but the kind that you eat and what they can do and all the different things that they can. There's a lot of weird things about mushrooms. But Andrew, thank you for giving us your time tonight to come on the podcast. I'm really excited.
I'm excited as well. It's a pleasure to be here with you, Ben.
So, Andrew, before we hit record, we were talking about some of the stories that you've got to tell. And I want to go to one that we actually didn't talk about before we hit record. And we'll put you on the spot. What brought you to the Navy? What were you looking for from the military that life hadn't given you yet?
Oh, yeah. Great question. I was at the University Texas at Austin, and I just felt unprepared for so many of the obstacles and just different aspects of being out in the world on my own. And, I look back at it now and it's like, well, a lot of that stuff was pretty simple, and life was much less complicated. But at the time, I, felt like I should have been more prepared for it. And I started questioning, what am I going to do about this? And it was obvious that university was there to, try to weed you out, basically. And I was feeling like I was needing more. And I started looking into it. I remembered that I've always been passionate about music, and my instructor I was an oboe player, was this gentleman named John Cheville, and he had been the first chair oboist for the Army's top band, the one that follows the president around, that kind of thing. And when I was a senior, he asked me if I'd thought about military. I said, no, not really. I'm not going to go to college. And he said, oh, well, it was good for me. And that phrase coming from that gentleman, it changed my life. Just knowing that it was good for him, someone who I know and I respect. And he was a fantastic oboe teacher. And I studied with him for years. He was one of the longest, teachers I'd ever been with, I guess. I hadn't really thought about that before. Anyway, I went to a recruiting station in Austin, Texas, where they had, like at a strip mall, they had all of the services side by side, and they each had a separate office. And I remember, I figured, well, I'm going to check them out. And I went and talked to the Army. I went and talked to the Marines. And I knew that I didn't want to be in either one of those. And I was planning on joining the Air Force, really, because my dad had been in the Air Force. My grandfather had been in the Air Force. I had other family members who had been in the Air Force. It's just kind of the family thing. And the Air Force guy was just very unpleasant. And I went next door to the Navy guy last, and they were just chilling out in there. And they're like, oh, yeah, here's a book about the Navy. And they flip open, they've got the big leather-bound book of all the different jobs and stuff. And they had pictures, and I was flipping through, and I found a guy in a hammock on the back deck of a Mark V. And I was like, what is this? Oh, yeah, that's the Special Warfare Combatant Craft Crewmen. They're like the modern day Vietnam boat guys. And, they've got some kind of like line they say to describe it. It sounds really good. I was like, yeah, all right. And that was it.
That moment was the one that changed everything then.
Yeah, I could see myself doing it. And it was, at that time in my life, it was like, I'll sign up for this. It'll take a while to get there. And by the time I get there, hopefully I'll be ready. And I had confidence in myself as someone who could handle adversity. And so I never looked back. And so I signed up in July of 2001, and they do the delayed entry program. So they said I would be leaving in September. My mom dropped me off at the DFW airport to go to boot camp on September 10th. And she said, Andrew, I'm so proud of you. There's never been a better time to be in the military. And the very next day was my first day of boot camp, was September 11th, 2001.
That is like I don't know if it's just the mysteriousness to that and how it happened and how it probably still played so much of a role in what you chose to do later in life as well.
Yeah. Things happen and you kind of just have to happen along with them. And that's how I felt at the time was, all right, this is happening. I'm going to happen along with it. And when you make big decisions and, world changing things happen immediately afterwards, it kind of self reinforces in a way of like, oh, well, yeah, this just feels right. That like you're changing, the rest of the world's changing too. So it didn't require a whole lot of questioning on my mind. It just seemed like, well, if I'm going to join the military, of course, it's going to be like the day after we go to war. And it was all the more motivating.
Let's go back a little bit. So you said there was something that you were ill prepared for as you were in college, almost like you were missing some core components of your adulting operating system. As a dad to a 5-year-old, do you know what you need to do differently with him to help him avoid what you left or started your adulthood with or was missing with?
I certainly have strategies for dealing with the bigger issues that I felt like I was facing. Part of it is just how to get out on your own and be enterprising. It's a skill set to, take one thing, turn it into something else, and then, develop a strategy to get that, to do more of itself. And I feel like that's, sort of maybe the one of the kernel skills of being an entrepreneur. And having the sensibility to do something like that in an organized way. I know a lot of people who function that way. And, in my recollection, knowing people from high school and that kind of thing who are now very successful, it's like I can identify that these people were organized very early in how to administrate the things they were trying to get done.
I like that because there's a component of fatherhood. Well, actually, as I say that out loud, every component of fatherhood initially feels really messy. But when you talk about having structure, it's almost like you're trying to have a vision with a structure of not like a destination or a designated roadmap, but almost where you have the structure of like the bumpers on a bowling alley. Like you want your kids to understand that this is how you put the ball down the lane. Fathers are the bumpers, make sure they don't go out of bounds. But you're still trying to give them that path and that place to really explore that component of structure of how could they create a business when they're 10 to learn how to leverage money or to learn to leverage time so they don't have to go off and trade their time for money. Like these early components that aren't even taught or mentioned in school, but yet could be the structure that changes entirely how a kid sees the world.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and some of this stuff just becomes evident that they want to play in structured, orderly ways sometimes. I mean, we have this game where our son is a shopkeeper or shop owner or, restaurateur or whatever, and he'll come and, sort of act, we have this play where, he's exchanging, imaginary money for imaginary services or pizza or whatever. And so, but the more props and stuff that come into it, of like a cash tray and Monopoly money and all this stuff, it becomes more minute detail. And, we start learning, the numbers that are on the bills and this kind of stuff. And he's paying attention when it's display and it's generating interest in the, sort of reality through play. And the more we can do that kind of stuff, it feels like there's an extension to that where, we're playing with these ideas of building things or being enterprising. He had a great one early on. He started finding worms everywhere because he was out in the mushroom compost. And hey, mushroom compost is great for worms. So he gets this idea that he's going to start a worm company and help other farmers that need worms for their gardens. And he starts collecting worms and putting them in a bucket of dirt and stuff. And like, you know what? We could sell worms to like the local gas stations. They're selling them for people going out to Nolan Lake. And it's like you could invest, you could just, with no investment, you could start a worm farm as a 5-year-old and have a busy, business of selling. We could sell night crawlers to people, to hip campers, to the gas stations around here. And that could all be his project that, didn't cost anything to start, but we get $5 every time he sells a little container of them. And, that kind of, it's like, damn, that could fund like an entire, Pokemon habit or something.
Or buy his first car.
Yeah. Once
I'm sure that's a little bit scary as to thinking about your 5-year-old driving.
Right. We're dealing with much more immediate things these days. So,
trying to fund the roadblocks fund.
Exactly. So, seeing those kind of opportunities out there, I'm trying to take advantage of that. And he's interested in the farm, and he likes to come down and clean things, really. And we make a big deal out of it. When he cleans something, that is fantastic. At the farm, he gets a bucket out and he'll put some soap in, get a big brush, and he'll get something, covered in suds and then hose it down. Man, that's amazing. We just try to celebrate that kind of, the work involved and get something clean. Because, I honestly don't know how the Amish do it. Like having children that seem to be interested in everything that the family is doing, that seems like a thing that is more of a pre-modern era thing. I don't know.
I've always been fascinated by that same thought of the family connection, the family, we're in it together. And just the idea of working together. And also you mentioned a story when we were visiting about asking the Amish for help to put up a shed. And there were these young kids doing things that most teenagers are afraid to do. And just like the work ethic and the confidence these kids would have at such a young age, and like observing that was just kind of an interesting experience I remember you mentioning about.
I was in awe. Honestly, it's impressive. And the kids that I know, and we are all neighbors, and they enjoy their lives in a profound way. So, I've talked to a lot of people who feel like, there's certain aspects of modern culture that they prefer. And I certainly, question whether or not I have the grit to live that lifestyle myself. I seriously doubt it. But
it always looks good on a postcard in the summer, but it's really tested in the winter when you've done the work to hopefully survive and have enough food for everything to get through and everything.
Indeed. And, we have a wood burning stove here, so I've become accustomed to keeping the fire going. But I mean, that becomes a way of life. And it's impressive. So I'm certainly better off having some Amish neighbors. That's for sure. I hope they're better off having me. But I'm sure they'd be fine either way.
Yeah. Let's go to a moment where let's rewind this story of entrepreneur spirit, because it doesn't sound like it was something that was always there. And before we were recording, you were talking about a story about really kind of where it all started, because you transitioned out of the Navy and just adopted what everybody told you needed to do. You picked going up to school. You mentioned going for music therapy. And take us to that time and like, just as it was unraveling, like you had this plan, but yet it felt like it was made out of, I can't think of a good analogy right now. And usually I have a good analogy, but it was just falling apart in those times where it just wasn't sticking and wasn't working.
Yeah. Well, it seemed like a really good idea at the time. But really, I've always been a musician at heart, and I've always had that as part of my life. And by the time I got out of the Navy, I decided that I wanted to put my effort into something, therapeutic in some way. And I knew I didn't want to go become a doctor. I just have a different skill set than the one it takes to acquire those skills. And I know I'm pretty good at some things and not so good at other things. And so, I wasn't looking to go be a rocket scientist or a doctor. I started getting into the idea of music therapy my last year in the Navy. And it just felt like calling. It's like, use music to make people feel better. All right, I am there. So I knew I was going to Louisville, and I got into University of Louisville, and they had a music therapy program, and I got into the program and went to orientation, meet and greet of the faculty and all that stuff. And when it came to finally sit down and hammer out my schedule, I was meeting with the head of the department, and this person presented an impossible for me to meet schedule. I was like, wow, there's nothing we can do about this. And the response I got was that it seems unreasonable, but this person had learned that there's actually very good reasons for these kind of difficulties. And that, I was working at a music store at the time, and it was just a perfect setup where I was going to school, had a job at a music store, was going to go be a music therapist. I was in the community already, felt like I was making connections and doing all the right stuff. And the schedule is tearing apart. And finally, the advice I get is to quit my job at the music store, which they acknowledged was a perfect opportunity. But quit that job and get hired third shift at UPS and try to make that schedule work. And it was all to meet a program requirement that had nothing to do with music therapy. And just felt like an impossibility coming from my mind of very structured, orderly, one team Navy organization. It's you go to take a class in the Navy and they're like, oh, you don't have a prereq? Well, we want to make sure you get this class. So, someone will give you a dirt dive or get you caught up or, find a way to make things work. And I knew that there was some way we could make this work. And this person was just not having it. And I was lucky. I knew I was distraught at that point. I mean, the schedule just wouldn't work with the schedule I had in my life, which I'd worked very hard to get. And it just seemed unreasonable. And so I was talking to a friend of mine who was a music therapist and came by the store just like the next day. And so lucky that this individual showed up. And, I described what I was going through him. And he said, it's okay if you don't want to do this, And it's like, man, hearing that really helped. Because it's easy to fall in love with a plan. And, this is advice that I knew already not to fall in love with a plan. I had a lieutenant who would say that exact thing, never fall in love with a plan. And there I was in love with a plan and didn't know what to do. But luckily, have people in our lives who are good influences and, sometimes just, give you a permission. You just need to hear that sometimes. And it's, and so that was refreshing. And I went to the counselor the next day, just a general counselor for the university. And it was like, what can I get into? Put me in philosophy or something. I'll figure it out. I ended up in chemistry, and that became my course of study until I realized that I just needed to graduate. I've been in for, when I lost the focus of having a plan from the get-go, it's like the whole idea was part of this plan. And it's like, it became a real conundrum to be like, why am I in school at all if I'm not fulfilling the plan that got me here? And that created just a long college career after that. Luckily I had the GI Bill.
You were on the Van Wilder plan, if you remember that movie, where he went to school for like the better part of a decade, or the Chris Farley plan. Not yes. Chris Farley. Tommy Boy would be the right character to label that is.
Well, I was relieved the valedictorian of my class was a gentleman who had been in school for 7 years. And, he described his situation, and it had been real similar to mine in that he had just gotten into school straight out of high school, but didn't have a calling, pulling him in any one thing, and was just, there because he was supposed to go to college, and, changed his interest at some point and had to, start from there. And so, it feels like that's a whole other thing. And that gentleman represented those of us who'd been in for a minute, very well, I should have.
Let's go into a particular area within that story. For a veteran that just got out, is hearing that they need to go use the GI Bill because that's the number one benefit that everybody talks about. that they should be doing that. What is that advice that you wish you knew that they need to know?
I knew this, and I did try to apply this as much as possible. And it's the mistakes that I made were when I wasn't applying this as hard as I could. And that is to treat school like you're on a mission, and to not lose any focus, and make it your hobby, make it the thing that, is interesting. And to just, if you got to learn the specs on, this, some people just have to immerse themselves in the details of something. It's like, don't immerse yourself in the social life. Don't immerse yourself in having another hobby. Just immerse yourself in this one thing and be monastic about it. Like, be your own monastery. And that alone will set you apart and will give, the times that I did this, I felt like I was, I felt like those were the times when I was most on fire, in terms of like getting things done. And it was because I had made the monastery of myself and was just, getting after it. And, that's the kind of thing. It's like people notice when you're, so into a singular thing like that. And it's unusual. And people are, will be like, oh, wow, how do you stay so focused? If they notice. But, in terms of like getting out of the military and feeling like you're doing something special, that you're still, out there getting it, getting after it, getting it done. A lot of what I missed, was the feeling of purpose that you get from, having a mission, or having that thing you're tearing into. And, it's that, put that focus into just the school. And if you're going to go to school, that's a big thing. If you're going to go to school, do something useful. It's a rough situation to get through a college degree and get on the other side of it feeling like it didn't lead to anything. I know so many people who felt like that. And the thing that would have made the biggest difference in their lives would have been to, go to a technical school and get a certification in welding or becoming an electrician. And, you're never going to be unemployed or not essential if you have those skills. And, they're much easier to get than masters and you name it.
Advice, because it speaks to the seriousness of what we need to take our life, but it also speaks to keeping a wide view of where we want to go and not closing yourself off to, like what you said, don't be afraid to throw out the plan. Don't be so stuck to it and married to it that you have to. I've heard it also called a sunken cost fallacy, that you're invested so much into becoming a doctor that the idea that you made a mistake that you could go back and start over, or even a lawyer would be a similar category. Like, your life, you only get one life. You either abort now or you're going to be all in and you're going to be 20 years down the road and wish you changed your life when you had that chance.
Yeah. And coming out of the military, especially, I think it's real easy to lose sight of the fact that when you're entrenched in a military position, or when you're, when you're doing something difficult and it gets harder, you have an immense, sort of resources, backing you up. If you're in the military or work for the government at all, really, obviously they're trying not to spend money on things they don't need to. But what I'm saying is that when things get tough, they have resources to throw at the problem that you don't as an individual. And it's easy to be like, oh no, I'm good at doing difficult stuff. Or I'm good at doing, Mission Impossible, whatever. That's a thing that I feel like in the military, it's easy to start looking at things like, it's just another job to do. We're just going to go figure it out and do it. And, in life, there's just some things that you're never really going to be that good at. And what I found was that I was constantly having to rely on the skills that are my weakest while I was in school. And I was seeing myself diminish the skills that I was the best at in the process. And looking back on it, it's like the things I was good at, I could have done, I could have gone through a lot less effort to get the stability I needed to actually focus on the things I was good at.
I love that because it highlights how it's an improvement process that we need to not fully be stuck to. Let's go into a different area. Let's go a different part of your story that I know is just as equally interesting. I'll speed it up for the audience because I want to get to the good part here. You had another random moment, not just the guy walking into your store and talking about like, hey, you don't have to do this life. You also had this weird random moment where you went on this journey, I believe, while you're in the Navy, up the Mississippi into Louisville, and ended up having like a drink at a bar where you met your wife. And then just to fast forward even a little bit further, I believe you get married, and your wife goes off to a conference where she hears about mushroom growing, and she comes back all excited that you'll never believe what I just came back and I'm excited to do. And that leaps into a whole new world. Did I get the story right?
Yeah. Well, when she went to that conference, I had been growing mushrooms as a hobby for a number of years. And so that was kind of what connected it was, she came back and was like, have you ever thought about doing that for real? And I hadn't really ever thought about it because I'd never met anyone doing it. Well, she had just met someone doing it and was like, hey, should we try to find a reason not to do this? I said, yeah, sure. And so we set out on finding a reason not to turn a fun hobby into a career. And we spent about 2 years, really working through the problem. And in the process, we built like a 200-page business plan. And finally, we were at a point where like, we can explain why this is a good idea. And we started, we called bankers and we started doing that. And eventually, someone agreed with us. And it's been a pretty good idea for the most part. I mean, you get into the aspects of, experience and the cost of experience. In general, things are working out. So, so far a good idea.
Now that you're in the mushroom area and you're in the entrepreneur world, and you look back through the lens of like, even in the very beginning, what you've talked about missing in school before joining the Navy, do you see that common thread? Like it was all leading to something bigger and even something nonsensical like being a mushroom farmer?
What I found was that the skills I lacked led me to having to improvise more often because I was just less organized than I really would like to have been. And so, constantly finding myself just, shucks, I forgot something. And I've been ADHD AF my whole life, and I've gone through the evolution of medications in that field. and, have something to say about each one of them. But it's always been a struggle of mine. Can set out to get something done and get distracted on the way. And that's normal for everyone. But some people, it's just very intense. And having the structure of military, helped sort of reinforce the more positive aspects of the way I work as an individual. And, coming out of that, life is very different because once you have a taste of it, you're like, oh, I like having structure and discipline and all this stuff. And it's like, all right, try figuring that out on your own now. So
I found the hard part when you're an entrepreneur is getting yourself out of bed, because knowing that you're the only one that suffers if you don't, like, that is like the final frontier of motivation. Because when you have a job, you have this like external accountability. Well, I don't want to get fired. But when you're your own boss, who's going to fire you except capitalism, essentially, when people stop buying your product and you go broke. But that doesn't sit in when you're waking up at 5 a.m. trying to convince yourself that you need to get out and do what you need to get done.
This is so true. We in the early days were doing everything ourselves, and I would constantly be up, harvesting mushrooms, at 11 o'clock. I've finished around. I've had days where I had to harvest in the morning and then do like a bagging production and then harvest again in the evening, because in the summertime things were just going so fast, and finish a harvest at like 2 a.m. and then have to get back up at I might sleep in that instance to like 7, but normally we're getting up pretty early, 5 or 6. We tried to change it up during the pandemic, and we're just like, there's a pandemic going on, sleep as late as you want. Because we laid off we had to lay off all of our staff. So it was kind of like that, but we gave ourselves permission to catch up on sleep.
Yeah, there is that component where you just gotta, okay, we need to listen to our bodies. We need to take the reality of what's around us and realize, yeah, we're probably going too fast and we need to slow down. Or just take the universal slap in the face that COVID gave everybody, that we were going too fast and we really did need to slow down.
Well, the slowing down thing, I don't argue with. I felt like things were moving at a pace I was uncomfortable with before the pandemic, for sure. And, living on a mushroom farm, things are at a pretty slow pace to begin with. So, it was interesting to see, people's response to, what I would consider to be kind of just the way things normally are, where you're like at home all the time. You don't see anyone. Nobody comes over to visit. You don't go anywhere else. That was kind of normal before the pandemic. And so it was interesting to see, this is what we normally do.
Yeah. Do you guys have a vision of where you want to maybe adjust the business as hopefully the world reopens here in the next year?
Oh, absolutely. One of the hardest things with mushroom farming is growing to your sales, matching those two numbers. And we've experimented with, building databases to, keep track of this stuff and predict when everything's going to be available. And we've gotten pretty good at that, actually. And so right before the pandemic, we were doing pretty well with mushroom growth. And since then, it's just been about going local and smaller containers and getting in grocery stores. But what we really are trying to square is what do you do when you grow more mushrooms than you can sell, is having a go-to answer for that. And our answer has basically been to dehydrate things so that, you got more mushrooms than you need. Well, they're going to go bad if you don't sell them. So just dehydrate them and extend their shelf life for a year. And so trying to figure out what to do with those afterwards has been the challenge. And so we're finally finding our way into markets of supplements and powders and value added stuff. And we've been in sauces now, doing it that way. And, that's the way we want to be able to do, is just to grow, the amount of mushrooms we want to grow, which, that can be quite a bit. But, when we try to max out the farm, we end up going crazy. We need to hire more people than we can really keep. It's a very delicate thing to have a mushroom farm operating at full capacity, at least at our size, because it's a lot of work. So, there's a comfort point where with the people we have available and the time that, we want to, put our lives, into it, there's a tempo that we want to be at that allows us to always meet our orders for our chefs and our groceries, and then to put the rest of it into something we know is going to have value. And that's been a real struggle getting to that point. But the pandemic helped get people talking who weren't talking before in the food distribution channels. And so we've found our way into working with some really lovely people who are doing some cool stuff. They've got this kitchen in Lexington that is a way to employ people who have, are looking for work that don't have any skills that they feel they can market otherwise. And it's to work in a food kitchen that processes things for other farmers. And it's kind of outsourcing that work and getting it done. And they're very organized and very good at what they do. So it's kind of like having a co-packer, except it's more of a custom process. So having those connections, game changer for us.
So it also sounds like you're still expanding on some of those almost missing components way back when, before you started the Navy, because what also maybe was missing before you went in the Navy is those connections to a wider view of how you could fit into the world. And what you're also exploring now with those connections is the wider view of how mushrooms can fit into the world in so many different ways, and understanding how, like, this is something that always kind of amazes me, but the brain has such a narrow focus, often what's in front of us, but the world is so wide, but yet we never really feel that width. We only feel how narrow and how much of a box we feel into. But really, like, once you start having conversation, I mean, the fact that me and you were talking because we stayed at a hip camp at your house, like, that type of random width of just continuing to explore all the different ways that people call happy, that in itself is something that I feel like we often get messed up in the wrong order, or even don't even explore as veterans on the other side of transition, because we often maybe don't feel comfortable in real life and having those conversations, but then limit adding width to even understanding, like, there's a world where everything could have went away during Corona because you just could have said, you know what, I don't have any more ideas. But knowing that you had this kind of like almost initial handicap a little bit, that you knew I had to widen and figure out where to plug this in, it was still kind of closing the gap on some of those early things that you were missing.
Absolutely. That, filling in these gaps, widening the circle, making the connections, that is, it's where it's at. And everybody I know in the food industry, it is, they are a measure of what connections they can be. All these people are trying to connect everyone. And it's like when there's a global pandemic going on, it's a lot harder to make those connections when you're moving things from place to place. But it's a lot easier when all you got to do is put two people in contact. And that was something I'm grateful for, was that, a lot of people were just like, hey, let's stop pretending like we're competing for every single thing. And a lot of relationships changed. I'm grateful for that evolution in particular.
So I hinted in the beginning, and I don't want to disappoint anybody listening, and this was something we dove into when you were doing the tour on your farm. What are some of the things that people have no idea that are true about mushrooms that they really, not necessarily should know, because it doesn't really help you in your day-to-day life, but there's just really interesting things to question what else you might not know? Because mushrooms are in this unique category where often they're doing the opposite of what you normally think something would do or what you would expect. And I feel like learning about these things where you don't know where the universe shows up different, like that is almost proof that there's other areas that I need to learn as well. And then that again widens my view and questions and gets me more kind of belief and confidence in these different areas. What are some of those random things that people need to know about mushrooms that they don't know?
Mushrooms communicate and are very sensitive. And so, we sometimes play music to them and believe that makes a difference. But in particular, they communicate with themselves. We do everything in small bags. And you can see how, as the fungus is colonizing this bag, we're talking about a bag of sawdust the size of a football. And, pick a spot on that bag and just insert some live fungal organism. And from that one spot that you insert the fungal organism into that bag, it's going to propagate to the rest of the bag. And it moves kind of like a wave just down across it, where the fungus part is white, the bag of dirt is black, and you just see this whole bag just turn white over the course of its colonization. And when it reaches the bottom where it can't go anymore, things start changing up at the top only then. And so you see this sort of communication where it starts telling itself, hey, we're out of room. And at that point, it starts trying to break through where it can. And a lot of times that's that point where you put the spawn into the bag. We have a filter there. And it can break through the filter, but it doesn't until it gets done colonizing the bag. And so, it's interesting to see how it waits until it gets to the bottom, like runs out of room, and then starts communicating to itself, hey, I'm out of room. And then it breaks through the bag. I would say, oh, well, maybe that's just a coincidence, but I've seen it happen like 1 million times. So, that one always gets me. And then just how sensitive they are. I mean, they're detecting the humidity, the carbon dioxide, the light, the temperature, and they're making adjustments on the fly as things change. And it's always to save itself or to get it, to the next generation. And you kind of see this very heroic attempt every time something gets out of whack in its environment, it tries to respond in a way that's going to help it the most. And it's always coming up with something new, or it's just like it's figuring something out. And you can see the kind of fractalization of its behavior of like, try a bunch of different things. Okay, these are the things that are working. Let's do all of it this way. And really get a feel of like, this is how nature approaches things. Like, we're going to go every direction at once, and we're going to see which are the easiest. And from there, we're going to see which ones gain the most resources.
There was one other fact that you mentioned when we were visiting about how they breathe like we do, which really kind of blew my mind, because I hadn't heard that in the context of a plant, because we're programmed to think the opposite.
Right. Well, for one, they're not plants. Plants are plants. Mushrooms are fungus. And they have their own kingdom. And they do things differently. So they breathe oxygen. When I say they breathe, they take it in. And they convert oxygen to carbon dioxide, and they let it out. The interesting thing that separates fungus from just about everything else is that they do the digestion of nutrients on the outside. So they excrete enzymes into the environment, and they break down any nutrients that are around them. Then they absorb those nutrients once they're broken down. And, so that way they don't have any internal organs or anything like that. And even bacteria are more like individual cells where they've got different things going on. Fungus, it's like every cell of a fungus is they don't differentiate until they start doing reproduction.
Yeah, that like the whole thing is just it challenges what you normally accept about the world when you assume that, like, even when I'm sure it's the same thing when scientists are doing like underneath the ocean. Like there's just certain things that defy like what they expect to find versus what they do see.
And I imagine when you start talking, especially about like magma and stuff under the ocean and bubbling out, it has a very similar footprint in the way of you've got all this pressure to go out in every direction, and whichever cracks are the weakest, that's the direction you're going. And funguses, that's kind of how they move in that same way. They push out in every direction, whichever direction is yielding the best way. But they just double down on that. And so you see, these big eruptions sometimes of it broke through a soft patch in the substrate, and things start happening very quickly. They double in size every 24 hours when they start blooming mushrooms. So that's one fun thing. It starts as a little pinhead and then can be the size of your hand, a day and a half later. The temperature's right.
Like there's just so interesting of a world. So hopefully that like opens up to the listeners just this world that you might not have known about, but that definitely is worth Googling and reading more about. And that maybe this episode has inspired you to look up maybe being your own mushroom farmer, because there was one other fact that I learned, that there was only like 200 mushroom farmers in the United States where all the mushrooms come from. So I also feel like it's still the golden age for people that wanting to step into growing mushrooms. Would you correct it as the golden age, or is it still kind of like, is this as peak that we're going to get?
I think what we're finding is that the golden age is being extended. I would say that if you had gotten into the mushroom farm lifestyle like a couple years before we did, that was probably the golden age, because there were really only a handful of people doing it, and only a handful of them really knew what they were doing. And, it was such a novel thing for a long time. Nowadays, what we're finding is that large distribution channels aren't great for gourmet mushrooms, because a lot of chefs are going to be using oyster mushrooms and this kind of stuff, and they just don't ship well. You can do certain things, but if you're a fine dining establishment and you want to have fresh oyster mushrooms, you have to have a local farm, or the next best thing would be a regional distributor that has a local mushroom farm. But once you start getting outside of your region, they're hard to deal with. The shelf life is incredibly short, and they change in appearance. So you can still use them much longer than they look picture perfect. And, that's a struggle we have, is that, people buy a mushroom, they want it to look good.
Sure, it's got to look like a picture on a catalog, even a few days after it's been picked.
Yeah, and we've always stood behind every mushroom we grow, and so our chefs, appreciate the work that we put into their aesthetic as well as their nutrient content. And so it's always been a real easy sell. It's kind of the whole package of, here's a beautiful mushroom that is good for you. We only use 3 ingredients: sawdust, wheat bran, and water. And then for the other ones, we use sawdust, soy hull, and water. So it's they're good for you. They're beautiful. It's an easy bag until the restaurants all shut down.
Until COVID hits.
Yeah, until COVID hits.
Well, Andrew, this interview has been just what I wanted to be, a good interview to crack open fatherhood, entrepreneurship, and real life in a way that I don't think many people challenge themselves deep enough to really look at how they can decide to be happy on their own terms. And that's what I initially just found the beauty in your story as I was hearing about it, is just how you found your own path and how different it was, but how much you made it your own. So I really appreciate you being open and honest with us in the podcast. I just have one question left for you that I ask all the dads before they leave. And what is a piece of parting dad advice that you want to make sure that every dad knows that you maybe had to learn the hard way, or is one that this is just dad advice that keeps on giving because I keep having to relearn it over and over maybe?
Yeah, the one, it was a piece I learned subconsciously and came out in a dream. And it was that, and it's, I'm just going to tell you the advice and not get into the rest of it. When you're with the baby, be with the baby. And every time I lose sight of that, things go awry. But when I set the time aside, or when I just decide, hey, we're going to go play, and make that decision that I'm going to put my phone away. I'm going to not be distracted and not let myself get into other stuff. When my son comes and says, "Hey, Daddy, can you play?" Say yes, be with the baby, and be with the baby. I still call him a baby. He's a fine young man, but when you're with the baby, be with the baby.
I love that, because there is so much to get just distracted with in life. But the simplicity of that advice is one that a busy dad needs to hear, a military dad needs to hear, that you just can't multitask. And I first learned this when our kids were really young and they get sick, because they were daycare kids. So sick was just almost something that came with the role. And initially I was always like, oh, I can take care of a baby and try to work. Or when they were toddlers, try to take care of the toddlers and work. And it was always a complete shit show every single time of either they didn't let me work because they just wanted snuggles. And it was just literally, I mean, I remember times with my son Dylan just sitting on the couch all day, and he was still too young to like understand what was going on TV. So I essentially just binge watched like Seinfeld, I remember. And just like that was what the day looked like. And then I remember as a supervisor, my employees would try to do that on my team. And I was like, nope, I'm not. I'm going to shortcut the learning here for you. Just take the day off, focus on your kid, because this duality of trying to balance them is just going to ask too much, and you're going to get frustrated, and your kid's probably going to have to bear the brunt because you're going to get frustrated and probably lose your temper on them.
Yep. That's it. And yeah, it's, yeah, I love listening to your show because I always learn something. And these, every dad has just such a, their own experience, and I'm trying to learn from all of them. So I'm so glad to be here and part of the group sharing what they learned.
I hear you. And that story of learning is something that like this podcast is based off of because of where my story came. Like most of this podcast come from the pit of my own story. And it's either my lesson that I've had to learn, or it's someone else humbling and saying like, yes, I messed up and here it is. And this is how we can learn from it together. Like that's the key part that most military dads get wrong, is we weren't designed to ever figure this out by ourselves.
Absolutely. It's great when you share that information, because it's the most valuable stuff. I don't know how many people, are just so close to the relationship they want to have. They just there's something eluding them that they're not getting, and someone else, probably been there and done that, and just to have those lessons learned. I applaud you, Ben, for putting yourself out there and making this knowledge available. So you got my kudos.
Well, thank you, Andrew, for hosting us and graciously giving us some mushrooms and giving us a tour that day. And even though the weather wasn't great. And so it was just a lot of good times when we were there. And thank you for coming on the podcast tonight. Like this story, I know is going to help bring a dad home, because it's going to give him a path that maybe he never even thought was possible. So again, just thank you for your time tonight. And I'm looking forward to getting this episode out there and helping dads come home.
Thank you for all you do, Ben. Glad to be here. And